is a serial killer stalking the Portland area. So far, 6 bodies of women have been found. The MO and the COD, cause of death, is being kept close to the vest. We know one victim died of blunt force trauma to the head, and marks were found on the neck. The rest is being kept super secret. Why? But so far, 6 women have turned up, their bodies found within a period of months, within 100 miles of each other. I counted up the jurisdictions involved, and there are 6 jurisdictions involved. That would be Portland PD, Multnomah County, Oregon State Police, Polk County, Clark County, and Clackamas County. I guess that's 6 law enforcement agencies involved. So far, the victims have been named as Kristen Smith, Ashley Reel, Joanna Speaks, Bridget Webster, Charity Perry, and one unidentified female believed to be either white or American Indian or from the Alaska area. Now, what does this mean? 6 women found within 100 miles of each other. Their bodies found, for the most part, in rural or heavily wooded areas without a lot of details, such as the MO, the modus operandi, the causes of death. Were the bodies clothed, unclothed, semi-clothed? Were the victims raped? Were they bound? Were they face down? Had their bodies been altered in any way? We know that the women are largely white brunettes. We believe between the ages of 22 and early 40s. Joining me is a man that may have some answers. Chris McDonough is joining us, director of the Cold Case Foundation, former homicide detective, has investigated over 300 cases, and host of The Interview Room on the YouTube channel. Chris, thank you for being with us. What do you make of it so far?
Thank you, Nancy. So I think what we've got going on here initially from a law enforcement investigator perspective, you want to identify the oldest victim in relationship to the one that was most recently found, and then the first victim, and then get those 2 agencies together and see what kind of correlating information can be gained from discussions with those 2 agencies. And what I mean by that is you want to establish patterns of those victims and then see if there's anything in between that with the other agencies that would correlate to both the first and the last victim patterns of behavior. So from that,
well, let me understand what you're saying. You're saying that you start by taking the first and the last and a known chain. There could be another body that's found, that will be found, that predates the, as of right now, first victim, or another body could be found post-dating the last known victim. Why do you look at the first and the last victim? What is the significance as opposed to looking at all of them?
Well, what you want to establish right away is if you can identify a contact site, and meaning a geographic region where these 2 victims, using the first and the last as the example, may have had a correlation to a geographic region. And then from there, you're able to figure out potentially, okay, what is the draw to the suspect to this particular area where these 2 victims may have a correlation.
So when you say point of contact, you mean a location point? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, a geographic region, right? I mean, if we look at these 6 women, you've got a main freeway there, the 205 and the 5, the Interstate 5, in that area. It's about 100 square miles. So if you have the very first victim ever found at a certain location. And if you can somewhat put the last victim into that geographic location, well, then that shows that the suspect is comfortable in that region. And so immediately you know that this could potentially be his hunting area for the other 4 victims as well.
Right now, authorities are saying they do not believe the cases are connected, but we also know the theory that they are is gaining momentum. What do you think about that, Chris McDonough?
Well, this case almost immediately reminds me of Ronald Porter. Do you remember him?
Oh,
Nancy,
yes.
from 85 to 88. So at that time, believe it or not, I was a vice detective. I didn't go into homicide till 89. That said, I was in vice, and we were hearing from the girls on the street that there was some craziness going on. And so Porter was working in a little silver car, driving around and picking up transients, as well as prostitutes and just hitchhikers. And over time, there was a task force that was put together quickly, and it was called the San Diego Homicide Task Force, where the vice guys, and I happened to be one of them at the time, were sent out onto the streets to kind of figure out what the temperature on the street was and what the girls were saying. Well, I can see the investigation quickly with these 5 agencies. There has to be a liaison between all 5 agencies talking to one another. And before they establish if this is going to be something that they're going to be able to connect through DNA or through, other scientific means, before they throw those resources in that direction with a potential single individual versus, various individuals, they want to establish a direct link to each of these victims somehow. DNA is the obvious, the most obvious
Exactly.
answer to that.
That's what they need. They need DNA. And I find it very difficult to believe that these women were not raped or sodomized or attacked in some way where we're not going to get DNA. That's going to be the way to do it.
Yeah, 1,000%. I agree with you. And then the next, obviously, is what is the manner of death, right? Is it blunt force trauma? Is it strangulation? Is it a combination of, weapons or et cetera? With the Porter case, the question was, had he changed his victimology? Because there were children also at that time that started to come up missing in the San Diego area. So there was a lot of dynamics going on behind the scenes, and I would think at this point, the reason they're taking their time and coming out and saying there may or may not be connections is because those dynamics are starting to be figured out even by the agencies involved at this point.
What does that mean? That was a word salad. What do you mean by that? Do you mean, and I have 6 agencies, although it keeps being reported as 5. I've got Portland PD, Multnomah County, Oregon State Police, Polk County, Clark County, and Clackamas County. That's 6. Okay, but whatever. When you have that many agencies getting together, what do you think they're doing?
Well, and it could be 7 too, by the way. It could be Bureau of Indian Affairs if
Yes.
the other victim is a Native American. Well, what they're doing right now is they're trying to figure out jurisdictional, guidelines, right? And they're trying to establish, okay, well, we've got one, and they have to figure out who's going to take the point on this. And that usually typically goes back to the first body. And so it could be that first agency. And if they don't have the resources, then they have to establish a task force. And when that task force is established, then each agency assigns a detective to that task force, and the funding comes from that individual agency to make sure that detective can function properly on that task force.
Let's talk about the similarities, because that's one way to determine if these murders are connected. We know they're murders because of where they were found. One was found in a gutter. Many are found in rural or heavily wooded areas, forest land, nowhere near where they live. 2 of them I tracked were found off one particular area within 3 miles of each other on near Flavel Street, Flavel. One off I-205 near Flavel, and the other near an intersection near Flavel. So that would be, and I have them in no real chronological order, but number 6, I'm using the unidentified body. We know to have long dark hair. Oh, that's a similarity I came up with, Chris McDonough. All of these women are white females with long-ish dark hair. One of them is a darker brown ginger color, but still dark. The rest are definite brunettes. We've got Kristen Smith, no COD yet. Ashley Reel. We have Joanna Speaks, Bridget Webster, Charity Perry, and the unidentified female that we believe is Native American. So, given their disposal bodies, their disposal locations, and that leads me to the conclusion they were not killed in those locations. They were all dumped in forest or rural areas, out of the way places, killed elsewhere. All white females, similar size and build, all brunette. One is a kind of a reddish brown hair. A lot of similarities found within 100 miles of each other, and all found fairly close together in time. Chris McDonough?
Yeah, so we have March and April seem to be the 2 months, right, Nancy?
Right. That's right.
So, yeah, so taking all those variances...
They've all been found over a 6-month period.
Okay. And so, staying on the path that you're on, and I agree with you 1,000%, we have all of the physical characteristics that could be,
Have you ever looked at Bundy's victims? His murder victims?
Well, yeah. And,
very startlingly similar in physical appearance.
Yes, 100%. And what nailed him, right? The Volkswagen.
Yeah.
So down at the lake with the two gals. And so now in this case, what I think the authorities are probably going to be pressing for pretty quickly is there, obviously it sounds like there's a vehicle involved. It sounds like there's various dump sites. And so they're going to be looking for some type of video management systems, i.e., any film from locations that we just talked about earlier. About
when you say vehicle, you're so right about Bundy. The Volkswagen had a plethora of evidence inside. Then I think I just heard you say Koberger, the white Elantra. I mean, that was the key to the case, really.
Yes, exactly. And so now we have this guy. Do we know if this is where he's killing the girls in the car? Maybe that's a crime scene of itself, potentially. So that vehicle that he's using to transport these women, wherever they got in that vehicle, that would be what we would call a contact site, as you know. And so as a result of that, then you want to establish any kind of type of electronics around that particular contact site, video management systems, traffic cameras. Those are the types of things you want to start looking for And this is why it's important to start with the first victim and kind of get down into the nitty gritty in terms of really understanding her life through what, as
I'm
you know,
curious
what we call
about last seen. I'm curious about the circumstances surrounding when they were last seen. Now, one victim, let me find her, was last seen at it's actually real, last seen at a fast food, kind of a transportation stop in Portland. I find that really interesting. She was found in woods near Eagle Creek. Now, that's the one in Clackamas County. Were the others at food or gas stations, restaurants or gas stations, before they went missing? I'm very curious where they were, and that leads me to the MO of the killer, if there is, in fact, one person responsible for these. The fact that they're all found within 6 months, they're all white females, brunette-ish, they're all between 25 and 40 years old. That's pretty similar, and within 100 miles of a 100-mile radius, and disposed of in the same manner each time. What I really want to hear is cause of death and the last seen, last known location where they were seen. What about it, Chris?
I agree with you. And where it becomes so critical is if, in fact, it is a transport station, i.e., with a restaurant attached to it, like a bus station or something to that effect.
Or like a truck stop.
Okay. Then
a
there's
rest
going to
stop.
be video.
Where there's a restaurant or a diner, or a lot of rest stops or truck stops have vending machines or short order cook counter, something like that. That's what I'm thinking of when they call it a transit stop. And we really only know that COD, blunt force trauma, on one victim, Joanna Speaks.
Well, let's hope that there is some video of some sort at those rest stops. If they're run by the state, there's a high probability there is. And that will definitely be a huge, huge lead. And then simultaneously, the other stuff coming in, i.e. the DNA, if there was DNA found at the victims, on the victims at the autopsies, and any other information.
That reminds me, Chris, I know at least one of the victims still had on her jewelry, so obviously was not a robbery of any sort, which leads me to a sex motive, which leads me to possibility of DNA, as you first mentioned. The fact that she still had on her jewelry tells me this was not someone just trying to rip the person off, take their cash and credit cards, and bonk them in the head. It's not like that at all, Chris McDonough.
Yeah, so let's go back to Porter for a second on your thought process there. When the one victim that actually connected him to all the other cases, they took larva, and the larva was able to establish a really narrow time frame for the investigators. And hopefully, in a case like this, they may have that type of evidence.
You know what, McDonough? You're going to warp speed 4. You got to explain when you say larva. You're talking about a very highly defined niche and homicide detection, and that is the study of entomology, bugs, as it relates to homicide. It's forensic entomology. Please explain what you meant. It's really fascinating, disgusting and fascinating at the same time.
I love being on your show, Nancy. Always. Thank you so much, because you keep me focused. I appreciate that, because I get zoned into this, my experience level. So long story short, the larva in of itself will be able to establish a potential time of death because of the life cycle of the larva. And an entomologist, to your point, will be able to come in and say, this is the life cycle. So it will be able to help the investigator establish, okay, if this is the time frame when this started, and the larva went through this cycle, then we're able to establish a date potential to where this victim was alive and at a location. And they're able to work back to try to find that location, which we, again, called the contact site. And that means there's a high probability you may also be able to find the suspect in that same geographic region where the victim was. And that's what they're looking for, I would submit.
So there, it's a matter of calling on a forensic entomologist to describe the exact progression or age. It's very often blowflies which are found on human remains. And if they've been there, say, 6 hours as opposed to 1 day or 2 days, you may be able to determine how long the victim has been deceased. It's a very precise science. I'm curious about the physical characteristics of these women, because I've noticed that predators often look for the same type of victim. And I think that that can bind cases together in a series. But of course, what we're really going to need is DNA. But that said, also serial killers are also often categorized or connected by the MO, which is not entirely necessary, because we saw Ted Bundy start with luring people into, well, he started with breaking and entering. Then he went to luring people into his vehicle, the one you described, the VW, and then he went back to breaking and entering at the end of his infamous career in murder. So MOs can and do change. So you can look at the MO to connect cases together. Also, a really fascinating aspect is the staging. For instance, in BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill Dennis Rader, he liked to redress his victims after raping and murdering them, redress them and take pictures of them. So that's where he derived satisfaction from that, where some killers get satisfaction from the actual act of asphyxiation. So you can look at the bodies and determine similarities in the way they were killed or how the scene was staged, and in this case, disposal. That is staging. Would you agree?
Yes. And the physical characteristics, if we look at, the victims, Ashley, Bridget, Joanne, Kristen, and Charity, and then if we look at just...
And the unidentified
pictures,
woman we think is a Native American with long black hair.
Yes. I mean, they do have similar characteristics, which could be, playing into this individual's fantasy, if it's a sexually motivated crime, which there's a high probability, and you know more than anybody, you've been in the courtroom so many years, that when these individuals get to the place where they're going to take a life, there's a whole buildup.
So you mean prior rapes or prior sex attacks or even peeping Toms?
Absolutely. The voyeuristic aspect of this, the preparation aspect of this is all part of the sexual fantasy. Then eventually that plays itself out into the homicide. And by the way, it would be interesting to see if there's a progression in relationship to from victim 1 through victim 6. That would also be very important to know, because that means the fantasy is changing as well as evolving, like Dennis Rader. I mean, but remember, he would draw out all of his stuff, and yet it was months in advance where he would adapt that fantasy, and then he would play it out himself, and then in hopes that it would work out the same way with his victims. and it's never that way, but right, you know that more
Right.
than anybody. It just, these guys are just so sick that they think it's going to end up, being better than what they had anticipated, and it never does. It never ends up that way.
I find it really hard to believe, although authorities are saying there's no connection, that 2 dead women are found less than 3 miles apart. Now, I'm talking about Kristen Smith and the unidentified, we believe to be Native American woman. They're found 3 miles apart, less than 3 miles apart. Now, Kristen had been missing since December 2022, but that doesn't mean a lot to me. That's only Jan, Feb, March, April, May, June, 6 months. She hasn't been missing that long. So you've got 2 women found within less than 3 miles apart. Yet they're saying that's not connected.
Well, that's very significant. It is very significant because if they do find similarities in terms of physical evidence and or manner of death, you have to take a hard look at that. And this is what, experts can come in on a geographical profiling aspect of it, because this tells us that this is an area that is very comfortable to the suspect. This individual is comfortable in that geographic region to return and put a second body there if they are connected. Because, Nancy, I mean, how many times have we learned that, these serial killers, they come back to their victims to relive the fantasy?
Like Bundy. Bundy did so often.
Yeah, and he went back even as sick as he was for necrophilia, to relive it one more time.
So what do you make of the announcement that they're not connected?
Well, I think that's a cautionary statement right now by the agencies. It is possible that they could be, they're leaning that way, evident of the fact that 3 of the agencies are all talking to one another. It is possible as well that the other 3 aren't connected. So I think they're going to err on the side of caution right now.
Okay, Chris McDonough, we wait as this case unfolds. Nancy Grace signing off. Goodbye. Thank you, Chris.